My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of the church's early years and earliest believers, not just adults, but children too, collected in this book, Champions of the King, the Story of the Apostles. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words parental guidance recommended.
Lucas, Ephesus. Lucas jolted awake. "My job," he muttered to himself. "I make graven images. That's not something a Christian can do. What was I thinking?" He sprang to his feet and pulled on his outer tunic. The sun was just coming up, and his parents were still sleeping as he slipped out of their home. Grabbing some bread and cheese, he wandered down the street, munching and muttering to himself. Paul had been right. Decisions did have consequences. When he had told his parents of his choice, they were not happy with it. "Nonsense," his father said. "You can't be a follower of this Christ person. That's all there is to it. The entire economy here in Ephesus is based on the worship of Diana. Everyone here earns a living making and selling things either for the temple or to the pilgrims who travel here to worship her. You have no business hanging around with these Christians, and you may not become one. That's all there is to it." But I am one. I was baptized this afternoon." "Well, just forget it. Young boys make mistakes. Just consider this one of them. You'll go back to work for Demetrius. I don't want to hear another word about this." "But Not another word," his father exploded. Lucas didn't know what to do. He had prayed until he fell asleep. "God of Paul and Dion, God of Priscilla and Aquila, please help me to know what to do. My father won't even listen to me, and I'm afraid to say anything more. I have to go to work in the morning, but I can't make more graven images for people to worship. I want people to worship you. Please help me to know what to do." Then he had fallen into a restless sleep. Nothing seemed much clearer this morning. Suddenly he realized that he had arrived in front of the gate to the silversmithy. "Maybe I can talk to Demetrius about this," he told himself. "He and I have had a lot of conversations. Maybe he will listen to me." Gathering up his courage, or what was left of it, he walked into the courtyard. "There you are," Demetrius said. "I'm glad you're here early today." Lucas nervously smiled. "I came early because I need to—" "I'm glad you came early," Demetrius said, "because we have a problem here. This Paul person has been doing way too much preaching here in our city. At first I thought he was harmless, but he's not. Do you know that the people who have listened to him are getting rid of their statues of Diana? Not only that, but they are spreading the word to other people. Worship at the temple is way down, as are offerings. And we still have a whole bunch of statues left over from the past 2 days. They're not selling well. Our friend down the street who sells the books of magic and spells says not only that the demand for them has fallen off, but that he has heard that people had a bonfire last night at which a bunch of these believers, or whatever they call themselves, brought their books and burned them in the public square. Can you imagine? We've talked it over, and we just can't have this. The entire economy of this city is built around the worship of Diana. This Paul seemed harmless in the beginning, but he's going to ruin Ephesus. We won't be able to make a living. And not only that, we won't have the travelers coming here. This Christianity stuff is spreading everywhere. Everyone who makes a living feeding and housing the tourists and selling things to them will be unable to support their families. All of us will starve because of this Paul person's God." "That's what I needed to talk to you about?" Lucas started again, but Demetrius interrupted him. "I've talked to some other people, and we're going to gather later this morning in the town square. I want you to round up as many of your friends as you can and show up. I'll give a silver coin to everyone who comes and participates. I need a lot of you young men with strong voices."
"Why? What are we going to do?"
"We're going to protest and drive this Paul character out of town."
"I can't be part of that," Lucas said slowly.
"Of course you can," Demetrius replied. "Now go get your friends and don't come back without them. We need as large a crowd as we can get." But, he protested. "Out you go," the man said, shoving him out the gate. "Go on, you know what you're supposed to do. Get on with it. I can't stand around talking all day."
Lucas walked down the street. "Jehovah God," he whispered, "God of Paul and Priscilla and Aquila and Jesus whom I've given my life to, what can I do?" Frustration welled up inside him. "I just don't know what to do." Suddenly, he realized what he needed to do right then, even if he couldn't figure out the rest of it. Someone needed to warn Paul. He turned and ran toward the house of Aquila. Lucas watched from the edge of the crowd. The huge mob filled the entire city square and marketplace. Demetrius had worked them into a frenzy as they all shouted,
"Great is Diana of the Ephesians! Great is Diana of the Ephesians!"
He noticed that many people seemed to have no idea what they were protesting, but were just going along with the rest. Some of their slogans even contradicted each other. Though the excitement was contagious, Lucas stood with his arms folded across his chest in silence. Other believers had kept Paul from coming to the city square to address the mob. He didn't think anyone could speak to the frenzied crowd. He wondered if anyone could talk sense to them. Perhaps someone, but not Paul. Finally, the town clerk stepped up onto the bema, or platform.
"Fellow citizens," he shouted.
Somehow, the mob quieted a little. Lucas shook his head. If they hadn't listened to Alexander, one of the believers who had tried to speak to them, would they pay any attention to the town clerk? Then suddenly things settled down. Maybe they would listen.
"Fellow citizens," he shouted again. "Is there anyone anywhere who doesn't know that our dear city Ephesus is the protector of glorious Artemis and her sacred stone image that fell straight out of heaven? Since this is beyond contradiction, you had better get hold of yourselves. Such conduct is unworthy of Artemis. These men you've dragged in here have done nothing to harm either our temple or our goddess."
Acts 19:35-37, message. A murmur rippled through the crowd.
"If Demetrius and his guild of artisans have a complaint," the official continued, "they can take it to court and make all the accusations they want to. And if anything else is bothering you, you need to bring it to the regularly scheduled town meeting and let it be settled there. There's no excuse for what's happened today. Besides that, the Romans take a very dim view of this kind of behavior. We're putting our city in serious danger. Remember, the empire doesn't look kindly on rioters."
The crowd's response grew louder.
"I suggest you all go home and think about this."
To Lucas's amazement, the crowd broke up, and people slipped off quietly. What had been a screaming mass of angry people suddenly melted into a few knots of men talking quietly among themselves. "Oh, thank you, God," Lucas whispered. He headed toward home, wondering if his father had been in the crowd. He hadn't seen him, but he wasn't sure. When he walked in the door, his father met him.
"Where were you today?"
"In the Agora," Lucas answered truthfully.
"Well, that's not what Demetrius told me. He said you were supposed to come back here and gather some friends and meet him there. You didn't do that. I saw you standing off to the side, not even participating in the demonstration."
"That's true, but those involved in it were reprimanded and sent home, so I thought it was all right just to watch."
"It's not all right," his father exploded. "You work for Demetrius. Well, at least you did, but you don't anymore. If you're not going to support him in his business and do the things he asks you to, there are plenty of other young people who will. He doesn't want you to come back again, and you can forget this week's wages."
Not sure how to respond, Lucas swallowed hard. He had prayed for a way to get out of his job, but being fired didn't feel good either.
"Furthermore," his father continued, "you are a terrible embarrassment to the family. Are you still planning to follow this Paul person?"
His son slowly nodded.
I have been baptized as a follower of Jesus Christ.
Well, as long as you feel that way, you're no longer my son. Get out of my house and don't ever come back.
And with that, he pushed his son out and slammed the door. The boy stood there, stunned. What would he do now? He had no place to stay, no money, no belongings, no job. "Are you seeing this, God?" he whispered. "Do you know what I should do next?" Then, as he had done so many times that week, he turned and walked toward the house of Aquila. Perhaps Paul would have a suggestion. Lucas stretched and yawned.
Are you tired?
His friend Eutychus asked. "Not really," Lucas replied. "Paul spent most of today dictating, and I'm not used to sitting for so long." Eutychus laughed.
If I had to sit all day and write things, I would just hate it.
I don't mind that much. Traveling with Paul has been fun, and I didn't have a lot of other options at the time, so I was glad that I know how to write.
I bet you've been to a lot of interesting places,
Eutychus commented. Lucas nodded. When we left Ephesus, we went to Macedonia, and Paul visited places he had been before. It was like a family reunion at each town where he had started a church. Also, we went to Corinth, which was really interesting. My friend Dion had come from there and had told me so many things about it. It was interesting to see the places he had talked about and meet the people I had heard stories about.
Does Paul have you write a lot?
It depends. Sometimes we're traveling. Sometimes he's busy preaching, and he does not accept money from any of the congregations for his own needs, so we spend some time tent making. But we have written some really long letters. For example, he sent one to the Galatians since he had started several groups in Galatia and had heard some disturbing things about them.
Like what?
Well, when they were baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, they were delivered from all of the rigid rules the Jews had imposed on themselves to be good enough to please God. Then new teachers told the people that they still had to keep this rule and that rule. The people there became confused since they wanted to please God and were afraid to make him angry. So they did what the new teachers told them. Paul wrote to them that they didn't need to be so afraid.
Does he write only to the churches he started?
Eutychus questioned. Oh no, one of the letters we finished recently was to the church in Rome.
Paul hasn't been to Rome. I heard my father say that. How could there be a church there?
There are a lot of Christians around now. The faith is spreading throughout the whole world, and there is a church in Rome. Paul wants to visit them, but I'm not sure we're going there next. He's been talking about returning to Jerusalem before he visits Rome.
Really?
Eutychus said in disbelief.
Why would he go there? That's the most dangerous place in the world for him. The Jewish leaders hate him.
I know. I don't understand it exactly, but there are a lot of times when the way Paul thinks doesn't make much sense to me. But he's interesting to travel with, and I really like acting as his scribe. I've learned a lot.
If you say so.
Well, Lucas continued, I need to eat some supper now, if I'm going to get any before the preaching tonight. This is Paul's last night here, so it could go on a long time. Eutychus sighed.
I know what you mean. Let's find some food. My mother probably has something ready.
The two boys headed for the home of Eutychus. The evening meeting had already lasted for some time when Paul paused in his preaching. Suddenly someone stood up and waited to be recognized. Lucas glanced at Eutychus and raised an eyebrow.
It's Agabus, his friend whispered with a yawn. He's a prophet.
By now, Agabus had pulled off his belt from around his waist and tied it around Paul's hands.
If you go back to Jerusalem, the prophet said, your hands will be tied just like this, and you will be imprisoned.
Eutychus's father jumped to his feet.
Paul, you must not go.
The whole group began to speak at once, everyone giving their opinion on what Paul should or should not do. Finally, the apostle raised his hands.
Stop. I understand that my mission may be coming to an end. However, I need to go back to Jerusalem, whether or not I'm arrested.
Then, is this the last time we will see you? One of the women in the front of the group asked Paul. Paul sighed.
I believe it might be.
Tears began to glisten in many eyes. Lucas felt a knot forming in his stomach. What about me? He wondered. God, are you watching? Do you see this? I smiled and drew closer to the young man. If only these humans could understand. Yes, the Mighty One is always watching. And yes, he has plans and backup plans and more plans and resources that would stagger the mind of his fearful human worshippers. Everyone settled down now as Paul began giving his final words of advice to the group of Christians he had started years before. The boys slipped over to the far side of the room, where they could talk softly without causing a distraction.
"Hey, Lucas,"
Eutychus whispered.
"if you and Paul go back to Jerusalem and Paul's going to be arrested, what will happen to you?"
"I don't know."
"It would be hard for you to take care of yourself in a place like that. You're not a Jew and don't know anybody there. What would you do?"
"I don't know," Lucas repeated, "but I do know that God is taking care of me, even when it looked as if my whole world was falling apart in Ephesus. I guess He'll have to take care of me again."
"I wish I had as much faith as you did. You always seem so strong. Must be from traveling with Paul."
Lucas smiled.
"Not that strong. I'm scared too. But once you make a commitment and start following God, you have no choice but to continue trusting Him. There's no going back, and I don't think I'd want to even if I could."
Suddenly Eutychus yawned again.
"Oh, it's so stuffy in here. I'm sweating like a farmhand." "Me too. These stone windowsills are pretty wide. Let's sit up here. Then we can catch the night breezes and still hear what's going on." "Good idea,"
Lucas agreed. The two boys climbed up and sat in the wide window toe to toe, with their backs leaning against the sides. It seemed as if Paul had been preaching forever. Although Lucas tried to stay awake, he kept feeling his head drooping. He would jerk it back up and try to force his eyes to stay open. Suddenly he heard a sickening thud. Lucas snapped awake to realize that Eutychus had fallen from the window. As he looked down to the stone-paved street below and saw his friend lying motionless, it felt as if a giant vice was crushing his chest. Pandemonium broke out as people realized what had happened. First they rushed to the window, then for the stairs. Lucas remained as if paralyzed in the window. As the people gathered around Eutychus's body, the women began to wail. Lucas's worst fears had come true. His friend Eutychus was dead. I shook my head at the human sadness. The guardians had been present, yet they had held back on command as the youth had fallen out the window. The Almighty did not always allow them to intervene. Bad things happened to good people too. It was part of the horrible results of sin.
"Back up. Let Paul through. Paul wants to see."
The little knot of people parted to allow him to reach the boy's side. "He's dead," one believer gasped. "Look at the angle his head is at. I'm sure his neck is broken." They rolled the boy over onto his back. Blood trickled from his nose and ears. He was not breathing. Suddenly, Paul dropped to his knees and began praying. Then he seemed to be covering the boy's body with his own. I started with joy as I saw the bolt of energy cleave the heavens and shoot down into the dead youth lying on the pavement. It was the touch of the Mighty One himself. The boy coughed and began to move. Paul stood and then lifted Eutychus to his feet.
"He's alive! He's alive!" the crowd exclaimed.
"Thank you, Paul! Thank you!"
the lad's mother cried. The apostle shook his head.
"No, thank God."
The group hurried inside and started a meeting of praise and thanks to God for bringing life back into Eutychus. The boy seemed a bit dazed and embarrassed, but very much alive. Lucas just stared. Only a short time ago, he and Eutychus had been talking about trusting God to take care of them. Then the Lord had reached down and showed them that He could fix anything. Even death was not a complication He couldn't handle. After drawing a deep breath, Lucas smiled. If God could raise to life a dead person, certainly He could take care of a live one. It did not matter if Paul was arrested in Jerusalem. As Lucas watched, Eutychus's parents whispered quietly to each other. Then Eutychus's father approached Paul.
"We love you," he said. "You've been our teacher and our father as we've learned to grow in Christ, and you prayed for our son so that he was restored to us. While we don't know what to give you or to do for you to show how much we appreciate you, we'd like to do something for the young man who's been traveling with you."
"What do you have in mind?"
the missionary asked.
"If you're returning to Jerusalem where your life is going to be in danger, would you consider allowing the lad to stay and live with us? We never had any more children after Eutychus was born. If you would let him remain, we would love to keep Lucas and treat him as our own son."
Paul rubbed his chin thoughtfully.
"It's true that I traveled to some dangerous places, and I don't know what could happen to the lad."
He paused, not needing to finish the rest of his sentence. Then he glanced over at Lucas.
"How do you feel? Would you like to stay here in Troas and become part of your friend Eutychus' family?"
Stunned, the boy nodded. I would. You've been good to me, and I have loved traveling with you. But if Agabus is right—"
"Of course Agabus is right,"
Paul said simply. Lucas stared at his feet.
"Very well then. Lucas, I'm giving you to this family."
He turned to Eutychus' parents.
"This young man is my gift to you. Love him and care for him and treat him well, for he's precious to me."
"Oh, we will,"
they solemnly replied. Lucas glanced over at Eutychus. His friend grinned back. "I guess that makes us brothers," he said. "I guess it does. I told you the Lord could take care of things." Eutychus reached up and rubbed his head. "Yeah, he certainly did. I just wish it all didn't have to be quite so dramatic." "Well, it never has to be again, as long as you stay awake in church from now on." And I smiled too. Once again, the Mighty One showed his love for these fragile people and his ability to take care of them.
This broadcast has come from the book Champions of the King by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.